Thanks. Welcome, everybody, to Caribbean Labour Solidarity's meeting. The meeting today celebrates International Women's Day, a day when all women from across the globe celebrate the issues that they have. And we are mindful of what they're saying, and we wish to support them in their endeavors. It is not something to be separate from the activities of men, but something to be compared and contrast. What we have today are two excellent speakers. We have Sister Marsha Hinds Myrie and distinguished elder Jean Small. Now, Sister Myrie, a member of the executive of Caribbean Labour Solidarity, is renowned in her country and also renowned in Canada, where she teaches. She has been instrumental in the case of A, B, and C against the government of Barbados, a case that has overturned a relic of slavery in the way that children who are under threat and are vulnerable are treated. She's also done considerable research in relation to women in the Caribbean and the discrimination that they face, the triple discrimination. We also welcome elder sister Jean Small. Jean Small is a Grenadian, which is a good thing. She went to Canada and she was instrumental in one of the historic events that took place in Grenada. And some would say that she was the leader of those events. And having worked in Canada, she went to live and retired to Barbados. We are going to find out the history of not only the women's struggle in the Caribbean and elsewhere, but also, the work done by Sister Jean Small. Okay, so if I can hand over to you, Marsha, can I say to everyone, please turn off your microphone and otherwise we get to hear your innermost secrets. So, Marsha.
Thank you very much, Donat. And let me say good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone on the call. I want to start this session by saying thanks to Comrade Ozzy Warwick and thanks to the Caribbean Labour Solidarity for creating this space, supporting this space for us to reflect on what I call International Day of the Woman. Originally, as a socialist movement, that's where International Day of the Woman started. And I now know that because of Comrade Ozzy. I also discovered in reflecting on the history a bit that the day was celebrated actually on a Sunday to make sure that those women who were in employment that could not take time from their jobs actually got to participate in the activities. So I don't think it's by accident that we're having this meeting today. And I'm really, really happy and pleased to be here with you. So what I'm going to try to do today is to share a little bit of my research agenda, two related and unrelated things that happened in my research recently, and which I think give us some food for thought on this International Day of the Woman, or around the period of International Day of the Woman, about Caribbean women, about Caribbean women's organizing, about Caribbean women's contribution to our revolutionary efforts or uprising efforts, not just in the Commonwealth Caribbean space, but also in the diaspora. So very quickly, so that, you know, it kind of makes sense to you, hopefully. My orientation is that I'm a Barbadian Canadian. I've lived between the two spaces pretty much for all of my life. I'm an advocate working with women and girls affected by gender-based violence. I have 23 years of experience. When I first started in the advocacy space for women, one of the spaces that I was in a lot was UN spaces, feminist spaces. And I recognized and experienced those spaces as very toxic spaces. Women were trying to lead like men. Women were being unsafe to other women. And so I made a commitment that in my engagement of the work, after a period of time in active on the ground service, I would take some time to try to transition the movement to the generation of women behind me, or just, you know, who had more energy and stamina than I did at the point where I was ready to step back from the work. And so what I'm doing now, this paper that I wrote first and the conversation with Sister Jean and that kind of thing, is my way of offering to a new generation some thoughts and ideas about women's organizing in a way that I didn't have those. It's about, for me, a different way of understanding women's work and women's organizing in the Caribbean outside of feminism, which I don't feel like is a very useful construct. I more prefer homegrown models of organizing, such as Andy I's Conscience. Andy I was a very instrumental advocate in the Caribbean for women's rights, but also for socialism and for anti-colonial struggles as well. So I just need to tell you very quickly a little bit about my PhD research as well, because it is kind of related to how I'm approaching today the paper that I wrote and the conversation that I will have with Sister Jean. So my PhD investigated the development of a Caribbean intellectual tradition around the University of the West Indies and the University of Guyana. It looks particularly at how intellectuals approach the development of academic disciplines and how these academic disciplines were related to and different from Western approaches to knowledge making. It is because I am able to understand the Caribbean intellectual tradition in that broad historical context that when I heard about Sister Jean, for example, I understood her as sitting within a tradition in the Caribbean that is important for all of us to understand. And when I started to teach here Introduction to Black Canadian Studies, that orientation helped me to understand a very significant gap in the literature around the Sir George Williams affair that happened in the late 1960s Montreal, where mainly Black Caribbean students protest racism of a white professor. So what I'm trying to do now is to think about and talk about that moment, but also to think about and talk about just women's contribution overall to socialist organizing. And like I said, the work is related and unrelated, so there may be gaps and discomforts in what I'm going to do today, but I'm going to try my best. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just start by reading a few excerpts from the paper, Woman and Socialism. This was a paper that I delivered in March 2022 at a conference about socialism in the Caribbean. Caribbean Labor Solidarity was instrumental in pulling that conference together. There were some other partners. Unfortunately, or fortunately, because it led to all of this, when the call for papers went out and the publication was put together for that conference, I think pretty much all of the papers were accepted for publication except this one that focuses on women and socialism. And that led to Caribbean Labor Solidarity, very graciously finding space to publish the paper and then also to do this series to kind of let people know about the paper and know about what is happening. So I'm going to start by reading a few excerpts from the paper so that you can think about and listen to and get a sense of where I'm coming from with the paper. And then I'll segue into how I think that's related to the Sir George Williams affair and to invite Elder Jean to speak with you for a bit. So I'm just going to read the introduction to the paper. Like I said, you get a flavor for me and what I'm thinking about. What if I told you there's a song still highly regarded as an important mark of Barbados's folk culture that glorifies the street harassment of underage girls? What if I told you that even at the height of the Me Too revolution and the repositioning of views on men and acceptable masculinity manifested in the efforts to hold public figures like Bill Cosby and R. Kelly accountable, that Barbadian men were feeling no pressure to reposition themselves in relation to cultural and historical gender norms that legitimize the sexualization of pubescent girls and the general commodification of women? What if I tell you that the status the status and treatment of women in Barbados are issues socialist men, or many men for that matter, refuse to engage? The attitudes of socialist identifying men are specifically analyzed in this paper, including through a brief review of the content of the particular folk song. The song records the experiences of women going to the community pipe, what we call the standpipe, to catch water. The song begins with a male refrain and it says, "Every day she come down here, She looking so good, good. And every time she passed by here, I like to touch up she bumsy. I like to touch up she bumsy. I like to touch up she bumsy. And the females offer their refrain, and we actually realize that the person going to the pipe is a girl child. Every time I pass, they pull at me. Every time I pass, they pull at me. I'm gonna tell my mama, don't send me down here. The men retort by affirming that women and girls, and not men, are the ones responsible for avoiding harassment. They tell her, tell your mama, don't send you down here. The men also make it clear that they have no intention of stopping their harassment and that really no female in the family is safe. The exchanges in the song then expand to a conversation with other women witnessing the harassment. So the men say, if she mama come down here, the women say, you will trouble her. The men say, if the auntie come down here, the women say, you will trouble her too. The men say, if the sister come down here, and the women say, you will trouble her too. And if she pass back here, meaning the same child, they will trouble her too. The men end the retort with the women by reiterating the responsibility of women to keep themselves out of men's space. Tell she mama, don't send she down here. The themes and expectations in the folk tale cannot be archived as a past or bygone era in Barbadian history, especially when interrogating the place of women within the political and social frameworks that create the post-colonial societies. This song captures the Bajan male's expectation to have the attention and bodies of women at their disposal. The tools that developed in the Caribbean as part of the broader self-determination and nationalist project, heavily influenced by Marxism and socialism from the 1930s onward, have done very little to uproot the prevailing views about women. The paper argues that Barbadian men in particular, but also Caribbean men more broadly, have evaded integrating the needs and care of women into their agendas for creating nation states and their day-to-day realities. The paper contends that socialism, the major framework used to resist colonial social structures and reimagine a new society after independence, did little to create safe space for the issues of women and girls. I'm going to read excerpt 2 really quickly, the definition of socialism. So I've used the term socialism in setting forth some of the historical gaps between plantation society and the framework for resistance in the interwar period, but I have not defined the term. For the purpose of this paper, socialism is used to capture a series of related political phenomena that contributed to the overall resistance movement in the Commonwealth Caribbean, started in the interwar years and culminating in several of the former British colonies' strongholds, mainly connected by the Caribbean Sea, but including Guyana on the South American continent, declaring independence from the 1960s on. Various themes for the political movements, which were both interconnected and discontiguous, include self-determination, anti-colonial, anti-racist, nationalist, and Pan-Africanism structures. Margaret Stevens, in the book Red International and Black Caribbean, captures the ideological complexity of liberation in Black radical organizing. In discussing the connection between Harlem and the Caribbean, she writes that there was a hodgepodge of frameworks within which liberation was proclaimed and which represent a microcosm of the contradictions and forces at work in the political movement that was the new Negro Harlem and Commonwealth Caribbean scene of 1919. Stephen notes that despite the contradictions, the Caribbean represented a critical epicenter that promoted the growth and the spread of Black radical ideas. And that line that Stephen offers there is very important, because I think we underestimate the way that what was happening in the Caribbean moved with its diaspora to spaces like Canada and to America, and fed into what was happening in those spaces as well around anti-colonialism and around the issues of safety for Black people generally, but safety for Black women as a specific category in Black life. So with all of that happening, though, there are some contentions with socialism, and socialism is, I'm saying, somewhat of an unsafe space around that period. So just this quick excerpt to kind of talk about that a little bit. There are ways in which socialism has created unsafe space for women by absolving men of unacceptable behavior toward women. Through a discursive interaction between history and Marxism and socialism, this paper concludes that despite the historical subjugation of women by men, there is space for different engagements in the 21st century Caribbean. Men's embrace of the concerns of women and girls is not just a choice, it is amends that are outstanding and that need to be made. It is the final investigation and confrontation of all the ways that power relations affect the lives of women in the Caribbean. The paper seeks to add to the quickly growing literature, on different aspects of the Caribbean intellectual history. Now, I think I'm going to segue there into talking now about the Sir George Williams affair and into talking about perhaps why we heard a lot about the women, the men that were involved in that movement and less so about the women. And it has a lot to do with, for example, again, what Andaye and Selma James have described about women's care work and how women's care work is never really respected for its important position. This student riot that started in Montreal around 1968, 1969 was very important to the overall socialist movement in the Caribbean. And I'm just going to read this final excerpt to show how it moved back from Canada to, for example, the University of West Indies at Mona in the student riot that happened there. And of course, we also know that it had a ripple effect in Trinidad and their Black Power revolution as well. So I'm going to read this, and then I'll have a little bit of a conversation with Sister Jean about her positioning around the Sir George Williams affair. The Commonwealth Caribbean was an important living laboratory in the theories and praxis of Bolshevism, communism, and socialism. Pretty much every challenge to oppression, except those rooted in gender and resulting in unequal power relations arising from patterns of slavery that bore sexual privileges for men. The gender aspects of the plantation structure of society is still in place in the Caribbean. Men still expect sexual favors to be embedded as a perk to their social status. There's a willingness to overlook sexual and other kinds of violence against women and to blame the victims in all cases. Socialism has harbored men who are problematic in their behavior. And I draw the reference, for example, of the 2020 book by David Commission, The Pan-African Love Story of Arnold and Mignon Ford. Seemingly completely tone deaf to the influence and pushback of the Me Too movement, life in leggings movement, the book glorifies an older married man using his position of power to have a relationship with a far younger girl who he meets in the course of his work and activism in Garveyism. Commission notes that there is a mentor-mentee relationship between Ford and Innes, and that led to the end of his marriage and subsequently his remarriage to Mignon, who was 24, and 30 years her husband's junior. My reason for highlighting this love story is not to pass judgment on whether Mignon enjoyed a happy marriage or not. What the story reveals are the ways in which socialism overlooked the unequal power relations and traditional interactions between men and women that were rooted in the plantation experience. A part of the more recent challenge that social organizing has had with capturing mass imagination in the Caribbean region is its willingness to uphold particularly problematic socialist leaders. And I'm sorry that I have to make this segue in this way, but it is the connection with the Sir George Williams affair. So defiant defense of the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines comes readily to mind as an example. Gonzalez was a noted communist and socialist figure during his student days at the University of the West Indies at Mona. He was the president of the Guild of Students during the student protests that erupted after popular history lecturer Dr. Walter Rodney was denied entry into Jamaica after an intellectual engagement in Canada. However, Gonzalez's career has been blotted with accusations of sexual violence and inappropriateness by several women. Gonzalez's leadership mimics the plantation structure. As the overlord, he expects sexual availability from all women. Where there is an accusation, he expects to set it aside with the support of other men and to a lesser extent, women. And I'm going to stop there because what I want to do now is actually use that as a segue to get back to the Sir George Williams affair in Canada. Like I said, I started to think about and talk about the Sir George Williams affair a lot in preparation for my class on Introduction to Black Canadian History. And I realized because I was reading the story with an understanding of the Caribbean aspect and an understanding of the Canadian aspect, that there was a gap in the story. So as much as we have talked about the Sir George Williams affair, it's still as much as we have to talk about. And this is where I was talking to a friend of mine, you know, who just glibly said, oh, well, my mom was there. My mom knows about that. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And he graciously organized for me to meet his mom, who was Elja Jean, and Elja Jean told me her story. I'm still in the process of mining this story to create a paper around the contribution of those individuals who worked on this student riot from the aspect of, from the vantage of community. Because I think we heard a lot about, you know, how many millions of dollars were destroyed either by the police or the students. We probably will never know at the Sir George Williams affair, but what we have a not as good of a handle on is how the community supported and closed ranks around those students to help them to be able to pull off that student uprising in the 1960s. And I think talking to Sister Jean can help us to understand a little more of that. So Sister Jean, I'm going to welcome you now. I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to say thank you for listening to me ramble on for a little bit before I introduce you. I'm so happy to have you here this morning and to have this conversation with you in honor of you and in honor of all of the ancestors like you who have made space for people like me. Good morning, and thank you very much for being here with me today.
Good morning, and thank you.
Tell me a little bit about moving from Grenada to Montreal. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I was just working and I just figured that I wanted some change. And I had friends who were studying in Canada, and they always refer to Canada as a quiet and safe place as compared to the USA. So I decided to make a change, and I figured I would improve myself financially and educationally. So,
sorry.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, because I think you're going to answer what I'm asking next, which is for you to describe a little bit about the Montreal that you find when you come to Canada.
Okay, at that time it was during May and it was summer months, so it was kind of welcoming, upfront, and but underneath you would get undercurrent of little non-acceptance, I would say, to put it mildly. And it was difficult, really, to get any respectable job. I remember when one friend of mine got her first job. Oh, that was the greatest thing that happened. She got to work in an office. That was the greatest thing because it was so difficult to get into that market. But from then, the lady in the employment office, she was kind of sympathetic to the Black people. So she did keep like pushing us, and one by one, we brought others with us, and we got into office jobs. Not well paid, but office jobs, which helped us to go on. Well, from then, lots of others began going to school somehow, or whatever way you wanted to do. And from then on, life then kind of changed. It went different ways for different people.
what leads up particularly to the student protest? As you think about the weeks and the days before that student protest, what is happening?
Before that, if I remembered, sometimes I'm not, it's a long time. I think it was before Dr. Rodney came, or he came after. No, he came before. Yes, and the students, and there was a Black Writers Conference where Stokely Carmichael was there. And that really enthused people. They begin to think in a different way about your Blackness, so to speak. So you begin to get a little bit more bold. And I don't think that, well, the Canadians really like that, because as a matter of fact, they think we were just there and they were helping us to be there. So therefore we should be a little bit more hidden there.
Grateful. Grateful for the help.
Yeah, right.
I remember when we were talking in Barbados the last time, you told the story about your hair and the impact that Stokely Carmichael had on you around your hair. Would you be willing to share that story with us?
Yeah, that was at the Black Writers Conference, and Stokely Carmichael was here. And when he spoke, he changed my life completely. He began to tell us, don't be worried about your hair if it's kinky, or your nose if it's broad, or your lips. That's you. Be proud of it. I went home that night and I always straightened my hair and I washed it out. And from then, my hair was never straightened up to this day. And there were lots of other things he told you about yourself. So you begin to really appreciate yourself, not being ashamed. Like in some places we were ashamed of ourselves. Because you will say, oh, your hair kinky, your nose not straight, your lip thick, and other people made you feel that way. And that's why people went, like the olden days, we say, press your hair or straighten your hair. So it wouldn't be kinky, it would look more like the white.
So this Black Writers Conference happens, and now there's an air of excitement. The Black people in Montreal are thinking about their hair, getting a little bit bolder with their presentation and that kind of thing. And then the student riot happens. What is the relationship between the community and that student riot? So well, how were you as, because I don't think you were going to the university at
No, I was not.
Right. So how are you connected? What are you doing?
Okay. Well, lots of the students would need help. So when, as far as they come up, or during the, some of them come up really struggling. So for the other West Indians who were there, they would lean on them for help. And like the guy who was really the center of the Sir George thing was from Grenada, Kennedy Frederick. And I was from Grenada. So he was very close with my roommate and I. So, and then as we were there early in Canada, we were a little bit more organized. So the students just centered around us. They would come to our house for food or to meet. As a matter of fact, the Black Writers Conference, a lot of the people that came to my house to have meetings.
So you're sitting or maybe preparing their food, and you are listening to them talking, you are listening to them strategizing.
Right.
You are in with that, what you say, for the lack of a better word, back room of the movement that is happening with these students, with these conferences.
Yes.
Sister Jane, that is not a little thing. I just want to tell you again, for everybody to hear me say, that is not little. You helped to organize this student uprising. That is what you did, is not little, and I want to say that to you. What do you think we can learn from the student uprising of 1969? As you think about International Day of the Women 2023, what can we learn? What do we need to tell young girls? What do we need to tell young boys about ourselves as Black people, about the meaning of what happened in Montreal? If you had a message for them, what would it be?
Well, I would say the whole Sir George thing was a whole teaching for your lifetime, I think. That you learned how young people stood up and fought, and what they fought for was handed down to all generations following. Like, it started, as I said, it was racism. That's how it started. Some Caribbean students had a lecturer, Professor Anderson, I think, and he really was racist, which they did prove now, and at Sir George that it really was. And they decided they weren't going to take that. After hearing people like Stokely and Walter Rodney and so speak, they realized that they too has a say in this work. So they confronted him and they reported him to the dean. Well, the dean did not do much because, it didn't matter. And what's really started at this meeting, the same O'Morley, that's what he was called after, but Kennedy Frederick. At this meeting, he was a spokesperson. So at this lecture meeting with this dean, he attempted to leave them alone. As they was talking, he was just leaving. So he stood in front of the door. And they called that kidnapping. As you say, if you block somebody from moving, you kidnap them. So that was his charge, that he had kidnapped the dean. And that's where the whole thing broke out, because he was charged with kidnapping, and then everybody had to go and try to get bail money, and it was a whole confusion that time. Can you hear me?
Were you one of the people who helped with getting the bail money and organizing around supporting the students who would got in trouble?
Yes. We had to help them. We had to cook for them. We had to have fundraising fests, as you call them that time, and beg, try to get other people in the community to help them. And what I could say, some white people did help. They did. There were some, they were kind of sympathetic to what was going on, and they did help.
Tell me a little bit, because I think we mentioned too that it was the effort of yourself and your roommate when the students had gotten in trouble, when Walter Rodney was not admitted back to Jamaica. You guys facilitated with housing and that kind of thing, hiding people, as I would call it. Tell us a little bit about that, if you're comfortable.
Well, yes. Well, after that, Walter Rodney was posited at my house. I must say, somebody brought him and he stayed there. And then there are other people who came because he could not go back to Jamaica at that time. So he stayed for a while, and we would have other students. He always had meetings, which he called groundings. And he would talk all about Blackness, about socialism and everything. And he tried to teach us, and he would say, everyone should teach one. And from that, the community and everybody kind of came together. And there was always meetings here and meetings there. And students, not only students from all over Montreal, all the universities, would join at meetings at the UNIA house. There was a house in Montreal, Mask. And we'll go there and people will vent their feelings and they'll bring different lecturers and so there.
And I just want to say for the purpose of the audience, the UNIA is United Negroes Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey's.
Garvey, right,
So again, the connection to, the Caribbean or anti-colonial struggle and how that is impacting the diaspora and how that is moving through the diaspora. One of the other things that I want to highlight about your work and your contribution to Elder Jean is just how you have advocated and held space for Frederick Kennedy. And I know that that is dear to your heart. And so I wondered if if you want to say a few words about Frederick and what happened to him after his experience of the student riot in Montreal, so that people really understand his sacrifice and his contribution.
Well, as it was said, he was made the scapegoat. He was the one that they really targeted. And I would just go a little bit back. He came from New York to Montreal, and he organized a march with the Black people. That must have been in Montreal. Thousands of Black people came out and marched. I remember singing through the Dorchester, "We shall overcome," St. Catherine, "We shall overcome." And I think from that time, he was targeted because that had never happened before.
And that march that he organized was well before the student riot.
Right. Long before that. So I said I think he was targeted from then. That's my impression. So, like as I said, but apparently he was the one, going back to how it started. He was the one who stood in front of the door to prevent Professor Anderson from leaving. And they said he kidnapped him, because they said once you block somebody from leaving, that's kidnapped. So he was charged with that. And there was the Montreal newspapers had a field day with that, and the students, and you come here and they're not behaving, And it was really, as we call it, a white lash. It was a backlash. It was a white lash because the whole white community, just most of them went against you, But we were they had strong people who were there and were able to get you through. And we were able to go through and help the students as much as they can. Either we had parties or we sold food or whatever we had to do, we did.
Do you want to tell us where Omowale
Kennedy
is now?
He is at the psychiatric hospital in Grenada. He has been there. That I think he is really forgotten. He has been there from after the riots in Montreal. We had to send him to Dr. Rodney in Tanzania. So he stayed there in Tanzania for a while. My roommate went there and they got married there. And he could not come back to Montreal. He stayed there for a while. And then he went back. He went to New York, where he had family living there. And he stayed there for a while, and then he got really kind of sick, a little mental breakdown. And the people apparently couldn't cope, and he arrived in Barbados, and he called me. Well, Walter Rodney's son was here, and he called me and brought me to him. And I called his family in Grenada and sent him there. And from that time, he has been in the mental hospital.
What year was that?
Like 1980 or some that time. That's long.
And you have worked to support him, his family, and his children.
Well, I am not his family, though. His family, he had family who could support themselves, who were they were in good position.
Well, I mean emotional support more so.
Okay, yeah.
Care work.
Right. Yes, that's what it is, because I find up to now he is so left, like I call, and try to talk with him and so forth, in Grenada, right, the hospital. His daughter tries too, but sometimes it is real difficult to get through. Sometimes she said, Auntie Jean, she can't, because sometimes I call and I can't, I'm in the Caribbean. But I could try and try and try. Ask somebody I know to ask to get through to him for me. Right now, I'm trying that because apparently he isn't doing too well, and he ran away twice, and I just wanted to know exactly what is happening.
Yeah.
But he is really forgotten, and I think for what the sacrifice he made, he should be better treated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for having this conversation with me today, for accepting this invitation. You are also one of the forgotten people, and I promise that I'm going to do the work that I need to do to be able to write a paper so that you're not only known to me, but that you're known to every Caribbean young woman, every Caribbean girl, because you are our ancestor. You are the one who stood up for us. Like you said, you gave us that generational legacy. And I always will appreciate that. And I will make sure that your story is known. Thank you very much for
can I say something?
Yes, of course.
Can I say something?
Please. Yes.
I think that the other women who were with me, like Kennedy's wife, we were roommates, you see? And there were other people who worked real hard. I think Alfie Roberts, I do not know if you heard of him, but he was really good with the students, and so he was very good getting their lawyers and everything. Alfie was really somebody, everybody Black in Montreal could depend on. And I think he was writing a book on the women. And I think my son has a friend who I think had the names of these women. There were quite a few of us too, you know, who had helped in all this. I thank you for being able to express my feelings on this whole thing. And what has happened though, Sir George, which is Concordia University, as you must have read, acknowledged that it was racism and apologized to the students. That was done.
Well, sometimes I don't know if an apology is enough, but I think that, you know, sessions like this where we get to come together and continue to talk it through and to learn the lessons of what happened there. I think this is important and this is healthy. If they want to apologize, I mean, you know, I'm going to leave that outside the off stump, to use a cricketing analogy. But I think this is where the real work is. So then with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you because I do want to engage with the audience instead of just talking at them. So thank you very much. I hope it came together in some way and that it was useful to someone. Thank you.
Marsha, I feel very, very humble listening to distinguished sister Jean. It is sometimes when you hear people who have been through these tribulations, you realize how little you have done. Facing the forces of the Canadian authorities and presumably the authorities of other states as well, and standing up to them. Well done. I would like to open the floor to people who may ask questions of both Marsha and distinguished elder sister, but I'm going to be greedy and put in my questions first, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead, Dana.
I've got several questions I could ask, but what you seem to be saying, Marsha, is that we have in the Caribbean, not the remnants, but a very strong structural sexual exploitation in which certain leaders, it seems from whatever political strand, believe that they can do things to exploit women. And because they are doing either progressive, presumably capitalistic things which are successful, that is protection for them to behave in the way that they're behaving. Are you saying that we must engage in a conscious effort to change that type of behavior? That's my first question. My second question is, are we accepting the history of our kidnapping and working to death on the plantation? Because oftentimes you will hear people say, particularly when it relates to violence, when it relates to beating children, when it relates to beating others, this is our tradition. So what should we do? Distinguished Sister Jean, my question to you is, Concordia University have apologized, and I suppose I can apologize too for anything. Are they seeking to make amends? So, Sister Marsha and Sister Jean, over to you. Everyone else, please put your questions in the chat or raise your hands. Thank you very much.
The question of leadership in the Caribbean is one that has been concerning to me for a very long time. What the Caribbean has retained from the plantation is something that I call plantocratic patriarchal culture. That's how I've been theorizing and thinking about it and writing about it recently. It is actually a double dose of patriarchy. It is patriarchy that is bound up in the construction of a plantation, which is a very rigid and unsafe space for all female bodies, but particularly for Black female bodies, because Black female bodies were not seen as human bodies. There were the sites of all kinds of violence, and there were also the site of exoticism. I'm sorry, that word always gives me trouble. And so what has happened is that we have taken that out of the historical, age of the Caribbean, and we've then brought it into the 40s and the 50s, where in a response to, women's organizing, feminist organizing, conscience organizing by people like Andia and Selma James, the patriarchy closed itself again. So you have it coming from the plantation, and then you have it coming as a fight back to women saying, listen, we need different. This is not working for us. And our leadership is very invested in that, both the male leadership of the Caribbean and more recently, and I will have to call out the current Prime Minister of Barbados here, Mia Mottley, on this topic, because it is not just men who are misogynists. It is not just men who create unsafe spaces when they become leaders for women. When you look at the fact that we have had 2 throne speeches under Mia Mottley as the first female Prime Minister of Barbados, and not one of those throne speeches has had any kind of hope for women and girls in Barbados. When you look at the fact that although, this female Prime Minister was sitting at the time of the government industrial school trial that you talked about, but yet we had to fight our way through the court, fight our way, to have our voices heard, to have the concerns of these girls raised. Then we understand that the problem with leadership is not even just the men and how they lead us. It is how our culture really has embedded and created unsafe space for women. But I'll leave it there and turn it over to Sister Jean for her to give you her reflections about Concordia and whether their apology is enough and whether they're making amends in her view.
Before you do, could you explain a little bit more about the government industrial schools in Barbados, their history, and the effect it has on young, vulnerable children, particularly young, vulnerable females?
Sure. The government industrial school is an 1863 colonial relic. When just after emancipation, there were a number of laws that were passed that were aimed at controlling the labor force that was now leaving the plantation in droves. People did not want to work on plantations. People especially did not want their children to be working on plantations, because we have to remember that during slavery, children were a form of labor. They weren't allowed to go to school. They too were working on the plantation. And so when parents got that liberation, one of the first things that they did is try to disconnect their children from the plantation. The charge of wandering is one of the things that was used within that post-colonial, post-emancipation Caribbean to be able to keep children and families rooted to the plantation. So wandering in its original intent was wandering off of the plantation, leaving a plantation space, not being willing to offer labor to a plantation. Children were taken from their families and placed in reformatory schools, industrial schools, and then they were forced to work on the same very plantation that their families were trying to remove them from. That relic has continued through the years. And like you rightly said, and like I would have explained, because of the connection between sexuality as a site of violence for Black female bodies, the industrial school also became a way to punish girls for their sexuality. And it was done both in a positive and a negative way. So by positive, I mean, if a girl was experimenting with her body and she was found by, you know, a father or somebody who felt that her experimentation or her sexual boldness was an affront to them, the government industrial school and placing her in that school could be used as punishment. In the negative form, if a girl was facing sexual abuse, and we know that incest is rampant in the Caribbean, so if she's facing sexual abuse from a family member and decides to run from that family to be safe, to have autonomy over her body, the school again was used as punishment because those girls were found and then they were placed in the school for running away from that sexual abuse. So the school, when the judge wrote the decision about the government industrial school, he made the point that the school is disproportionately discriminatory to girls because boys are not charged for wandering in the same way that girls are. It is a very, very, very problematic colonial relic, and it's not going anywhere because only yesterday I'm getting reports now of a new system that we are using to move children who have wandered from the government industrial school, but to send them through the family conflict unit of the I still call it the Royal Barbados Police Force, because that's how it operates. So they're criminalizing these children and still punishing these children. And although we have the judgment, there's a lot of work to do to close the gap between our culture and how we understand children and how we understand, you know, a whole range of issues around what makes children in need of care and sometimes in conflict with the law. The work is not finished. In a lot of ways, it has just begun.
Thank you. How long has Barbados been independent?
We've been independent since 1966, independent. And we also became a republic 2 years ago. And at the height of celebrating the republic, I had two girls who were institutionalized because they had wandered, whatever that meant. And so I did not celebrate our republic because I couldn't wrap my head around it based on what I was doing with those girls and the work at the government industrial school.
And slavery is supposed to have been ended almost 200 years ago. Sorry, your question to Sister Jean, could you please repeat?
No, you would ask. I was just pressing for her. You'd asked about Concordia's apology and whether she was satisfied that that was enough of an amend for them to make.
So over to you, distinguished sister.
No, I do not think it's enough. I think they should do something about Kennedy has a daughter. They should do something about with her. And I think somehow or the other, we should have something visible of Omawali's sacrifice. I think that he should not be left to just, well, rot, as I say, where he is now. So I think Concordia University, they owe him something. And I think they should take him out where he is and try to get better treatment for him. That's how I see it.
Is there any organization that Caribbean Labour Solidarity can contact in Canada that would push this this forward, this idea forward? Because here we have someone languishing in a institution in Grenada, having given such a great sacrifice, having suffered at the hands of the authorities in Canada, led by the Sir George Williams University. And from over here, we can't do much, I don't think. Is there anyone we can contact?
What I'm going to take, I'm going to take responsibility for that one, because I can probably do it easiest colleague to colleague across universities. I know that there's a group earlier this year. They did a conference at Concordia University around the Grenada Revolution, interestingly. And it was led by a young sister. I don't remember her name right now, but I know that that sister does not know the story of Sister Jean, the story of Omawale. I mean, I of course she would have heard about the Sir George Williams affair, but until I spoke to Sister Jean, a lot of what we are talking about here today, I didn't even know. And so I endeavor to, I have her contacts because she didn't invite me. So I will reach out and I will have a conversation with her, and I will see what the possibilities are, and I will report back to both yourself and Sister Jean on the possibilities.
Okay, thank you. I've got on the chat, great congratulations to you from Jeanette Campbell. Thank you very much, ladies. This is profoundly important. Of course it is. And Paul Ward has said, thank you, Sister Jean. Your personal account is very, very powerful. So great congratulations from great people here. On the chat, there's also links to the Sir George William affair, uprising, and there are further links to information that can be looked at in relation to the whole event. Distinguished Sister Jean, before I come back to you, I'll say to people, please let me have your questions. We have a very, very important speaker here, very, very important person, and let us use this opportunity to fill in the blanks in our knowledge. Sister Jean, you said something which touched me very, very much because I grew up in that period. You said that when Stokely Carmichael, as he then called himself, visited you, he persuaded you to think differently about your external self, which appeared to have had an effect on your internal self. And I remember that around that time, when I became aware, the idea that you needed to look white was actually very, very profound. It was that you would or women would use the pad and powder their face and so on. There would be a reference to hair as being fine or kinky. There would be a reference to people having light skin and so on. And this was favored. And I really never got to a situation where I understood myself until James Brown, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, until Muhammad Ali saying, I will not use my slave name, and so on. What have you seen as a result of this? Because we seem to have arced back to where hair has become an important issue, but hair has become rather straight again. What is your perspective on that?
What I think, though, it's a conviction. You have to believe. When I heard Stokely Carmichael speak for the first time, I went home, I washed my straightened hair, and that is over 50 years, and it has never changed from my natural kinky hair up to this age, because it was my conviction. I believed what he said, and I was proud of my blackness. I think a lot of people don't have that. So we all aspire to be white.
Mm.
And so you have to be white to be accepted. But I don't think so. I think you have to be what you are and who you are to be accepted.
Okay, well,
And
thank you.
if I could just tack on there really quickly, I think that is, for me, why feminism as a construct too, when we think about organizing women, is so dangerous. Feminism, for me, and I know that every sister will not agree with me, feminism is always white. Even when it isn't white, it is white. It is based on, feminism is set down on white supremacy. And the issues that we have around our aesthetic and around being accepted for our skin and our features and that kind of thing has been very driven by, in some cases, the hatred of white women. And that hatred was constructed again in our experience of the plantation and how women's bodies were pitted against each other. So white woman as wife and Black woman as concubine, and, you know, just the tension that happened there, and how, again, our bodies became a site of violence for white women to exact their revenge, to carry out their anger against us. And feminism has never confronted or talked about any of those things. And I just can't see it as something that would ever be useful for me with all of that baggage still there and still unsounded.
Okay, well, thank you. A question from Steve.
Yes, just to say that Marsha's paper is available to download from the Caribbean Labour Solidarity website. I recommend you to read it. It expands greatly on what she said, and I put the link in the chat. But I'll circulate it all as well so that people can get that and read that. That's just a sort of as a comment. As a question, really, as Marsha knows, I've been involved in the campaign about reparations for African enslavement. She got me an interview with Antigua Radio even. But what you're saying makes me wonder about the kind of gendered aspect of this, of reparations, because enslaved women were treated as bad as enslaved men in every respect. And then on top of that, they were abused. Yeah, there was sexual abuse on top of that as well. And I wonder if we perhaps ought to do, in the reparations campaign, ought to say more about that, really, if you see what I mean. So that, you know, as again, in a campaign, you don't want women to be hidden from the campaign like they've been hidden from history. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for that question, Steve. I think, you know, it's a pet peeve of mine. The reparations movement in the Caribbean is very patriarchal. I challenge you to think of the 3 top names that come to mind when you think of Caribbean, the Caribbean reparations movement. None of them is a female. And like you rightly said, there is a way in which, if we are going to properly talk about reparations, the gendered aspect of the conversation is very important. Hilary Beckles himself, in books such as Women in Barbados, that title is not correct, but there's also an article that he has in a book called Engendering History, which is where they look at the contribution or unwritten contribution of Caribbean women in history. And Beckles makes the point that women were always seen as the best slaves because they could do the work that men could do. But in addition to doing the work that men could do, they could also replicate slavery, because slavery was tied to the body of a Black woman through her products of reproduction always being slaves, regardless of who their fathers were. So Black women actually became the, if you want to think of it in a capitalist construct, they became the producers of the slave system. In addition to all of that, like I said, it was just easy thrills and kinks for those men in power who had ultimate control and full control over the bodies of Black women. So if you understand those three things and you understand the importance of women to slavery in the Caribbean, if you're having a conversation about reparations and you're not allowing yourself to shine a gender light, I think you're being very harmful. So thank you very much for that comment. And I think it is definitely a conversation that we need to have.
Okay. To Joseph Antoine, you've put something in the chat. I don't know if you want to explain what it is about. If you could raise your hand. I've got a question, again, from myself. Please, please, please forward questions by raising your hand or put it in the chat. To distinguished Sister Jean. In this country, many, many years ago, there was a campaign called Wages for Housework, in which campaigners, including Selma James, I think it was led by Selma James, argued that the work done by women is not measured. It doesn't form part of the gross domestic product or the gross national product. It is taken as given. On another level, the revolution in Grenada during those 4 years was phenomenal and brought certain benefits to women. However, it was led and dominated by men. They were always doing the speeches and so on, except where you had particular women's places, such as the National Women's Organization. And many in the National Women's Organization were extremely unhappy that the men went off and did things, and then the women had to do the housework, the child caring, the cooking, and then had to go off and do the training in the militia and do the voluntary work, fixing roads and so on, and how fair that was. At the time, being a rather stupid man, I thought, well, when we make the revolution, everything will be sorted out. Sister Jean, how do you think that attitude can be changed? How can men, in addition to discussing the higher levels that we're discussing, how can the day-to-day effects of discrimination, conscious or unconscious, be changed?
Well, women seem to be changing that on their own. Like women are going into every aspect that men, you know, their way, how they work, what they do. We have, look, we have all these, we have female prime ministers, we have female, when you go all over, so women have been really trying to take over in their own way, by themselves. We are not waiting for the men to give us a chance, more or less. That's how I see it. Because men are always the dominant person, and they will always be. So you have to forge your way. That's how I see it.
But before we come to Joseph, how can these entrenched entrenched since the days of capture and enslavement be changed? Just like with the government industrial school, we have inherited this thing and made it ours. How can we change the way we conceive of ourselves?
Well, look, we have, okay. We could check that with Dr. Hinds. She would be able, she's, you know, she's an example of women trying to change, and there are other people. And I think she would be able to answer that question better than I can.
The way that I'm doing it, to be honest, is that I'm getting closer to women like Sister Jean. I mean, what I needed, what I have always wanted, is strong women that I could look up to and use the model of the contribution that they have made to make my own contribution. So she's laughing, but I'm doing it by getting closer to women like her and to understanding, because I have had a knack for a long time, a hunch that community organizing of us as Black people, and organizing where we connect intellectuals with the community, like Walter Rodney was so adept at doing with groundings. That is one of the things that made our Caribbean intellectual tradition coalesce, right? And to hear Sister Jane share her experiences of it. And I smile all the time when she talks about, oh, well, I just cook a little food. Oh, well, I just prepare a little bed. Because in my experience of looking at the work of C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney, George Lamming, Mervyn Aline, you know, some of those intellectuals that gave us Norman Gervin, the University of the West Indies, there is always some woman in the background who was cooking the food and who was making the beds, and that allowed them to be able to do the work that they were doing. So I don't see it as more important work and less important work. All of it came together to make one movement and to create space for our resistance struggle, right? So that's why it's important for me in this stage of my career now to just write, to make sure the name of Jean Small is known, to make sure that the women that she is signaling helped her, were roommates with her, or young girls have to know those women, because that is where they will find their model of struggle from. It will not come from white feminism.
Wow, some of the stuff you said has hit, I'm sure has hit home with many men. I remember this joke that was said at the time, which is a man said to his male friend, oh, the wife just does the cooking, the cleaning, looks after the children, washes the clothes, and so on. And I deal with the important issues, nuclear weapons, you know, the economy, and society in general. And it showed that the basics are important, and men have hidden themselves from the basics. But let me not do a confession here. Let's go on to Joseph. Joseph, what are you saying?
Yes, if you permit me, without the camera, I will say that I shared this because some part of the conversation in that link I shared had to do with Concordia University, the struggles there, and highlighting the role of Frederick O'Malley and so on. So it'll be helpful, but it was in honor of Louise Langdon Little, the mother of Malcolm X, honoring the contribution she made in the struggle. It was organized by a community, the Latin community, and an organization, People's Enlightenment, Institute of People Enlightenment. I think very often a lot of these things are done and it is not known. So I just thought I'd share it so that it could help to expand people's awareness that some of the same issue we're discussing here is being discussed elsewhere also. Also, in terms of the question, I heard one of the persons was asked about how do we change the whole way men probably view women, or how the power structure. I think and some of that came up last night. I think you were there. I want to believe you were in that conversation in going to mark the Grenada Revolution 44th anniversary. Is that unless we do introspection, unless we, examine all the structure of our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, the traumas and so on, we will perpetuate the very wounds that have been inflicted on us by, over time, from colonialism, slavery, modern experience with our governments, our school system, even our parenting and so on. So unless we go inward, we have tried the outer revolution. Now I think we need to do the inner revolution, and I'm glad that Marsha are doing that, because we have done some work together already, and we intend to do more work on reframing Caribbean leadership and reframing the concept of Caribbean leadership in the Caribbean, what it really means to be a leader, whether you're a parent, regardless of your gender or so. But certainly, I agree with if not everything that Marsha is exposing. Yeah, I can see it, and I would say, without trying to stay too long, is that not much have changed in the Caribbean. The attitude of men, and even to some extent women, are still a colonial. Just imagine we still have a male god, an exclusive male god. Something is wrong. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Joseph Antoine. Your mention of La Digue is a place in Grenada from which
in St. Andrews. St. Andrews, that's where Malcolm X's mother was born. That's the village where Malcolm X's mother, Louise Langdon Little, was born.
And she too has almost been written out of the script because I read Malcolm X's autobiography, and whilst there may have been mention of his mother in the autobiography, it wasn't mentioned in great detail. Neither was it mentioned that she played an instrumental role in some of the liberation movements in North America amongst the African American population. And it's only now that she's being discovered. So here is another example. So thank you very much, Joseph.
And I just
in fact, she was a prominent member of Marcus Garvey's organization.
Correct.
And I just want to say there too, because I was trying to create a timeline this morning when I was thinking of Magine. Magine doesn't even know I'm doing a whole theory around her. So I was looking at the age range of the individuals that we're talking about. So Magine is late 1930s, Maurice Bishop is 1944, Bernard Cord 1944, Phyllis Cord 1943. And I'm sure that if you place Malcolm X's mother, she is somewhere in that age range as well. So I think we think about and talk about a lot about the Grenadian Revolution, but the revolution ends in 1979 or 80 or whenever it was, but it begins in the 1930s and 40s with these individuals who would have come through as the leadership. And now if we add in Malcolm X's mom and we add in Sister Jean, we realize that their contribution to revolutionary activity in the Caribbean and its diaspora is not just Grenada, but we see Grenada moving out and contributing in other spaces and in other ways. So that says to me that perhaps there's some work for us to do to mine that period in Grenada to really get an understanding of what is creating these individuals.
Okay, thank you. Distinguished elder.
We just spoke about Malcolm X's mom. She died in a mental institution. And we have somebody like Kennedy Frederick now. He is there and he might suffer the same fate.
Okay.
I did not know.
Well, comrades, just to say that this session is being recorded and we will post it onto the website. It is really an important discussion with someone such as you, Elder Sister Jean, and of course with you, Marsha. I feel that I have learned quite a bit here, but I think like when you learn something little, you realize that there is a lot more to do. And I have grown up in a period where the Grenada Revolution has had a profound effect on my life, the life of my family, and the life of my family and friends in Grenada and elsewhere. But there were certain things that were not correct in the revolution. And prominent amongst that is how the revolution treated women. And it is interesting, well, it is important that this issue is being raised now, especially from Joseph. Joseph and I were at a Zoom meeting last night where there was quite a bit of profound discussion on the revolution, not just being historical, but actually saying what mistakes were learned and what can we do for the future. And so I would like you, Marsha, to say, perhaps in more detail, I'm pressing you, I know, how is it that we have inherited, in fact, we've put on the clothes of our enslavers and called it our own. We've taken on this second-hand suit. And instead of saying, let us sew our own suit, cut our own cloth, we have kept all of these things, including the Royal Barbados Police Force. And in fact, the Grenada Revolution was Her Majesty's People's Revolutionary Government. We kept the Governor General in place for what I still consider to be very, very valid strategic reasons. But we kept the Royal Grenada Police Force and so on. How do we get rid of that? How do we throw off these old clothes and make new ones?
It comes back to something that Ozzy said in the preliminary comments to today's session. We removed white slave masters and replaced them with Black slave masters. Or we have not really challenged our power structures in the Caribbean. And so in the same way that Black women's bodies were trophies and social appendages of power in a white plantation structure, they remain the same thing in political structures with Black slave masters. I always say that, you know, I think it is one of the leftovers of some places in the Caribbean not having a true out and out revolution. Like it is one of the things, the treatment of women is one of the real remnants of us never really having that true revolutionary moment. The revolution always being put out before it does the work to purge the old system and create space for something new. And that is why we still have it. And this is why I'm not hopeful that we can get past it until we can come to that true revolutionary point in the Caribbean. There are many people who are afraid of revolution. You know, they see it as disruption and loss of life and that kind of thing. But I can tell you for many, if not all, of the girls who suffer incest, you know, at the hands of uncles and fathers and brothers in the Caribbean, they die daily. They die daily. So let's not be worried with, you know, the work of revolution, because lives are still being lost. Let's be clear. What revolution does is it creates space for something different. And I'm sorry, like, I don't have another answer, because after being in the trenches for 23 years, after doing the research that I've done around my PhD and now around women's leadership and gender, I don't have another answer. And I know it's not a politically correct answer, but it is my answer.
Okay. We have something on the chat from Laura Miller about Malcolm X. And I wondered if, Laura, if you'd like to come in and speak.
I wasn't expecting to actually speak to such an august body, but there is...
Thank you for that flattery. It's really great. I don't think my wife or grandchildren would really agree with you, and certainly, certainly Luke and Steve Cushion are looking away in disgust, I'm sure.
Just to say that, as you can tell from my accent, as everybody can tell from my accent, I was brought up in the United States, and I've been in England for 50 years, so I've sort of gotten acclimatized. But I just wanted to point out that there is a very left-wing writer. In fact, he was a member of the Communist Party in the United States, which was quite a brave thing to be for a long time, named Manning Marable. Unfortunately, he died some years ago, but he wrote an excellent biography of Malcolm X, and also another book in which he collected some of Malcolm X's speeches and other books on politics, particularly to do with Black America. I don't know that he's all that well known here, but I mean, left-wing people in the States I read all the way through it. I think I'm one of the few people who have, because it's quite long. And he also deals with the history of the Caribbean, where Malcolm X's parents came from and what their influences were. And I just wanted to point out that there is that book, and it's an extremely good book to read, I think. And it certainly taught me quite a lot.
Before I come to you, Ozzy, thank you very, very much. But Laura, what was your understanding of the recollection of Mrs. Little, Malcolm's mum, in the book?
My understanding was that his parents were very active. His father and mother, as I understand it, were followers of Marcus Garvey. And that was where he got his first teachings about politics. His father was an extremely active man in the South, and there's some debate about how he died, but there's a view that he was murdered precisely for his activism. His mother did everything she could to keep the family together, but was also active in the Garvey movement. So I don't think she was quite the shrinking flower that people have made her out to be. It's just that he left home at a very young age. He was sent away to live with other members of the family, because after his father died, his mother, I guess at some point, had a nervous breakdown and could not care for the entire family. But while she was with her family and with her husband, she was also a very active member of the Garvey movement. And I think they were quite amazing, to be honest, including her.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Ozzy. Could you unmute, please?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, great job, Comrade Denot, in chairing this powerful session. And I really want to congratulate Comrade Marsha, Sister Jean, and CLS for this very powerful and deep session. It exceeded all expectations. And I just want to say that emancipation, decolonization, freedom, they are all historical processes. And I think this particular session gave us some important insight and material for really rebuilding Caribbean socialism, because that is the future for the Caribbean and Caribbean people in order for us to be truly free. And as Marsha said, will we come to that moment of revolution? Well, we never really know, but we can all work towards it so that we can ensure that we achieve and realize in a fundamental way social justice for all Caribbean people, especially our Caribbean women and girls. So really congratulations for a powerful session.
Well,
thank you
very
for
much.
all of your work as well, Ozzy. Ozzy was, this is his idea, right? We're here today because Ozzy was like, we should do this, we should do it. Denot as well, from the time I told Denot about Elder Jean and the work that I was doing, he was very receptive. So this is one of those times where I feel supported by men of the Caribbean, and that is a good feeling. And I'm grateful to have experienced it and to have done this with you all.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you, Marsha. A sinner repenteth shall enter the kingdom of heaven, I think it is said. I have been a sinner. On behalf of everyone at CLS, CLS wouldn't exist without comrades behind the scenes, some of whom are here, some of whom are not able to be here, and also their family, because it requires a lot of work. So, Comrade Ozzy, on behalf of, in response to what you've said, thank you very much. I take it on behalf of the other comrades. And thank you, Sister Marsha, who's also a member of CLS. Jennifer, you want to say something, please unmute yourself and let us have your contribution.
Yes. Oh, my camera is, I forgot my camera was off.
Thank
Greetings to everyone. I didn't intend speaking really, but when I heard the tone at which the discussion took and went, I consider myself a senior now, but as a woman, I remember, I always keep saying now, I'm so happy to have been born when I was born in 1952. And I entered Bishop Anstey High School from the age of 5. And I left at the age of 19. And I entered when the teachers were all British, white British. About 85% of them were. And it was only when I sat common entrance, which it was at the time, to go into the senior part of Bishop Anstey, because I started in the junior section. And the amount of influence and influences that we got from the British, you know. And it's only now as an older person, and I'm reading, I think it was either Malcolm X and or the late Lloyd Best that said, you know, for us to have been educated by our oppressors is madness. Mm. And we didn't even know until Common Entrance brought students in from all various communities that they used to laugh at us, which might now be called bullying, but they used to laugh at our accent because we weren't aware that we had a British twang in how we spoke, because everything was so subliminal. But one of the main lightning rods, if you want to call it, or influences that affected me was when we broke away, because in Semte, when Semte happened, the first thing they did was to say all those expatriates have to return to their mainland. So all the British teachers, they left between 1970 and 71. So we got our first Black female head principal, Miss Sherland, who was a Southern girl, but she was living in Tanzania for some years. Very simple person, nondescript. And one of the first things she did was in our chapel, where we used to assemble for prayers. She commissioned the Ralph and Vera Bainey to erect a mosaic of a Black Christ. And that is still there today, where he is in an afro with a dashiki on and his hands outstretched. I can't remember if he had a halo, I'm not sure of that, but that is still there. And to know the impact and effect of that, I mean, I remember just as Sister Jean, Elder Jean said, you know, I took my afro, I think from either 1969 or 70 and cut off all my hair because of the influence of Angela Davis, and because we used to get the books. And what we used to do, that was even before we did GC, and so we had, he was then Dave Dabo and some others, they lived close by to Bishop Anstey on Gordon Street. And we would go over there after school to read some of the literature, grounded with my brothers, and especially, and they would be influencing us on what was happening in the Caribbean, because none of our history or anything like that dealt with Caribbean. It was all European and as we say, the oppressors. But now I see the importance, because now I'm a qualified gerontologist dealing with a nebulous area of specialty called aging. And in dealing with aging, which I still say up to today, aging caught me rather than I went there looking to do that. You're dealing with ancestors immediately. So the tone of all of what I do is rooted and vested there, that I may now be that channel, that I cannot afford to say I am now retired or I'm in retirement. I have to keep talking, because I remember one of the guys from Black Panther saying, we can't stop talking because the magazines are talking, like the Inquirer and all these different things. And for us to just say we are not going to talk again because, well, you know, I'm now in retirement and I'm disengaged. Now is when we need the engagement. So even though I was lecturing part-time, I only finished in like 2021, in social gerontology at UE, which we had to fight for as a course. You know, some of the things, and I think Marsha mentioned it kind of in passing, that, you know, some of the things that we say, like how Sister Jean say, you know, they cooked for them, and so almost as if this is a matter of fact, and it is lost in the bigger picture. So that I found that sometimes in lecturing in a course, just the preamble to what we would have been discussing for the course material, they were like, we did that? Like if we travel by the train and we all had that communal spirit, because we dealt like a community when we were all going to school, and we walked from school as whatever the distance. Some of them rode bicycles, but there was always that congregation meeting together, sharing ideas. Television was there. That's when we used to call it the boob tube. But coming through all these stages now, and I'm speaking some of the things that would now appear as, you know, minutia. The students are like, what are you saying? We were like that. So I recognize now that beside being a historian, and one of my professors, when I was in University of Maryland, was Professor Acklin Lynch, who's Trinidadian, very radical. And he was the one that really radicalized me, that gave me that grounding. But Kafra and all the others before, they were the genesis of getting us the literature and corralling us in this house to read and distill some of the things we were reading and get explanations for why and make the linkages. So I am here with that sense of, and why I call Acklin is because he held one of his classes in Africana study, which I did with him, on knowledge and responsibility was one of his courses. And that was when, during that course, during that semester, he deliberately chose 10 books by Black women authors, none of whom I knew, from Audre Lorde to, I mean, you name it, Toni Morrison, but that whole semester we only did Black women. And then hearing, you know, like Zora Neale Hurston, they don't even know when she was born because all their books were just discarded or hidden or burnt. And you had to salvage them and coming out of the Renaissance. So that was an opening for me to learn that other chapter of the diaspora, which these are Black American women of note that we knew nothing of, none. And when I went into study, when I began studying, I was 44. So I was an older student already. And having not heard those things, what university showed me is how much I didn't know of all these other areas that have to be read and who is doing the writing, you know, because we don't want somebody else who's given a version of what they believe they were there, when you have to be in the lived experience. So I'm seeing myself as a griot to be, if I haven't been there already, but it's a responsibility that I have to share the information of going through that passage. And I will end by saying, even my father, who was a prince, who was always an educator, and he being born in 1907, and all I did was remember growing up, seeing him from a baby. Always he read every night. He self-educated, because as he told us, when Williams and Ellis Clark and they got their scholarships, there were only 4 scholarships given a year, and you had to be top at the top to get that. So he and so many others, all those principles that they did, and Freemasonry was a big deal at the time, where they would commune. But at the same time, they didn't have a voice. He told me about the steel band when it wanted to be outlawed. And he had that tongue meeting with the governor who said, you know, it is paganistic and it is satanic, this drum. And Daddy had to stand in the town hall meeting and say, but my Lord, you know, we don't even, the thing didn't even have discernible notes on it. You couldn't hear a tune. And he had to say, wait, we are noticing that this is preventing the guys who had no employment from hooliganism and vandalism. And it might be something that would be useful. Look at where Steel Band is today. Otherwise, that town hall meeting, they were ready to just discard this drum because of paganism and satanistic tendencies. And so if it is somebody, and we are not bold enough, And that was one of the statements Ackland Lynch gave to us as students in the class, when he said, how many of us are willing to move from the small little R's of read, write, and arithmetic to become the bigger R's of redeemer, revolutionary, and reformer? And all those things remain here. I have a responsibility, and I will continue to speak, whoever my audiences are. I am now unbounded by retirement, so I don't have to be politically correct from being within the confines of what I'm supposed to say. But there are many ways, as the old people would say, several ways to skin a cat, and you can do it. So I admire you, Marsha. I bless you, Sister Jean, because you went through the fire as well, just listening to you. And I know how much you didn't say. I could just guess how much you didn't say. But we jamming still. And once I'm here with life and verve, I'm not going to stop, because I have that responsibility to my people, gender notwithstanding. Thank you so much.
Amazing.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much. We have had to lose elder sister Jean, who has had to go away. In closing, I had hoped to have got a sister here, Dawn Hill, to talk about, for a few seconds, about the Black Cultural Archive here in Britain. But it appears that she's not able to speak. So in closing, Marsha, I'd like you to spend a few minutes explaining what we can learn from this event and what we need to do to not just have this event, put it on a video, watch it a couple of times, and then move on to the next. What do we need to do to change the situation for women, particularly women of African descent in the Caribbean?
Big question to end with. I remember when I was doing, and I tell this story all of the time because it is so impactful for me. I think it was meant to be an awful thing, but I think it was the completion of a healing process for me. So when I was doing the advocacy around the government industrial school in Barbados, the Minister of Government who actually appointed me as the deputy director of the board, he stood up at a public gathering during the advocacy, and he apologized to people for having appointed me to the board. And he said to them that had he known that I was a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, he would not have appointed me. And I think, like I said, it was meant to break, but it was a point of healing for me, because it helped me to be able to understand the power and importance of my voice, and be able to understand the power and importance. I mean, I knew it before, but it was a reaffirmation, like Sister Rose just said, that I need to be there for the younger sisters of the Caribbean. And really, that is how I am going to make sure that this work isn't shelved. It has been, I guess you could call it, a personal crusade for 23 years of my life. I am now at the point where I'm ready to pass it on. And I want to be a part of passing it on because I want it passed on in a particular way. I want it passed on connected to Elder Jean, connected to Andy I, connected to Peggy Antrobus, connected to a number of strong Black women who have fought for their own liberation, but who have also fought more broadly for the liberation of Black Caribbean people. And really, that's the only way I know to keep the work connected, to keep my hands in it, and to keep it being an activity, and an activity grounded in principle and guided by doing no harm and helping the most amount of people that I can help. So I want to say thank you to Elder Jean's family for, facilitating this day and allowing her to share a part of her morning with us. I want to thank again CLS. This kind of work you can't do by yourself. And I definitely feel like I've found a safe and a supportive space in CLS, and I will continue to work hard and to do the work.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone who's attended this event. But before you go, please note that we've recorded this event and it will be on the CLS website. Just search Caribbean Labour Solidarity and you will get to it. I'd like to
1332.
I'd like to give particular thanks, although she has now left, to elder sister Jean Small, a wonderful woman, and giving us so much information that we haven't heard before. There is a lot more to be mined from her memories and her act. I disagree with her that she was only doing the cooking and hosting people. If I can use this male example, an army can be very good if it has no food, if it has no transport, if it has no accommodation, it is next to useless. So all of these men, as you've said, Marsha, who believe, I did this myself, it was me, I didn't, no one else, they're talking something, they're talking rubbish. So thank you very much. Please let people know about Caribbean Labour Solidarity. Get people to join Caribbean Labour Solidarity. Give us your money. You can subscribe to Caribbean Labour Solidarity and give us a small amount of money so we can continue this work. And our normal meetings are on the first Sunday of each month at 2 p.m. United Kingdom time. Please join us. We have had a tremendous success in the work that we have done. We've been in existence for over 43 years, having been formed by political exiles from the Caribbean. During that time, we've done so many things. It's on the website. We've saved the life of Desmond Trotter. We worked against apartheid. We worked to save the lives of the Grenada 17. A huge amount of work that we have done. And it's all because of us, because of the small number, not the members of the executive, but because of you as members. So please join us and help us. Unless anyone wants to say anything else, thank you very much. I don't see anyone is wanting to say anything. So see you next time. See you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, so Steve, I know we've said goodbye. You've posted Marsha's book